So I'm going to turn that on. So thank you very much for having me. I really apologize that I wasn't able to make it down there. I am making it a point to try and travel in person if I can. It just didn't work today, so I apologize for that. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay? Okay. If I need to speak up at all, please let me know. I'm pretty loud, so I can always adjust my volume myself and try and be a little bit louder for you guys. So what I wanted to talk to you today about is boundaries in schools. And the reason this has become such a big issue is because our legislature has really decided that they're concerned about issues that are going around the state. It's a small fraction of teachers that have boundary issues. And sometimes it starts out as just being friends with a student and then it moves further. And so we just want to make sure that we are being cognizant of that, watching out for it. And also, more than anything, I want you to watch out for your neighbors and make sure that your neighbors have appropriate boundaries and aren't crossing lines. You're all there for each other. It's been a hard couple of years, and sometimes when it's a hard couple of years or you're going through things in your life, it's easier to make mistakes and lose your boundaries. So you really need to be there for your colleagues to show them the way and to make sure that everybody has good boundaries. So a little bit about the Board of Educational Examiners. We are a board that has several members on it that are teachers, and we have teachers, administrators, we have a school counselor, we have an individual that works in HR. All of these folks come together and they do educator licensing. So if you have your coaching license, you went through our board to get that license. You have your teaching license, any of the licenses that you hold, you have to come to our board to do that. We are a small agency. We only have about 14 people. So this is that time of the year where it gets a little crazy and we're trying to process new individuals coming in and new coaches. And we really do a good job with that. The other piece that we do beyond the licensing is that we do investigations into ethical standards and violations of educator ethics. So we have 8 standards for educator ethics. The first standard is physical or sexual abuse or other crimes. If you go online, you can actually, and I'll send out a pamphlet to you guys. I'll send it on email so she can forward that on to you. But we have a pretty extensive 6-page pamphlet that goes through our 8 standards, and they get really detailed. But what I'm going to do today is give you kind of the nuts and bolts of those. But if you ever have time and you want to have some good reading before you go to bed, you can pull out our standards and really dig through them if you want to. But today I'm going to give you at least those nuts and bolts. The first standard is the physical and sexual abuse, which we're going to get into in more detail. The second standard is drugs or alcohol use on school grounds or on school property. This tends to be an area that we see a fair amount of. It's a mandatory reporting area. And it basically requires that if a teacher or someone with a license has drugs or alcohol on school grounds or is under the influence on school grounds or at a school sponsored activity or event, it can be an ethical violation, and your district is required to file a report with our office, and then we do an investigation. We see a fair amount of these, and I think in the last couple of years, things have been a little harder for people, so we're seeing it a little bit more. Just be cognizant of that. This standard would include, even if you just had, say you bought a bottle of wine for your friend for their birthday, and you brought it to school and you handed it to them in a bag, that would be considered a technical violation. It doesn't necessarily mean that the board is going to take your license for that, but it is a technical violation that your employer would be required to report if they know about it. So just refrain from all possibility from, doing those gifts or those things on school grounds. Just not a good idea, and you just don't want to have to answer to it. The third standard is falsification. And the falsification piece, that deals with your applications, job employment. It also deals with IEPs, if you have to fill out IEP information, testing information, any falsification. And if you're falsifying IEPs especially, that's a mandatory report area as well. So that's just one thing to be aware of, that you're always making sure that you're filling out things with fidelity and truthfully. We do even have instances sometimes where people leave information off of, you know, their licensing stuff. And we really do encourage, and we put information on there that encourages you to report anything and everything that you have in your background. That way, when it comes up, we already know about it. The next thing, the next standard 4, is misappropriation of funds. This is probably an important area for you to pay attention to, just because you might be dealing with fundraiser funds and things of that nature. So you want to make sure that if you are handling fundraisers and things for your students, that you are appropriately accounting for funds in the appropriate school budget fund. It's not something you can have outside of school. So there is, if you work with your administrators, they'll work with you on making sure you account for those things and that you're budgeting appropriately. You also don't want to have those funds. You want to make sure that you're not commingling with your own funds. People sometimes, you know, oh, I'll deposit it in here and then I'll pay it back later. You just don't want to get into that mess. Just try and keep it separate. So that you don't have that issue. We have 4 more standards that are generally covered under our ethics. Teaching contracts is one that we've kind of dealt with a lot in the last year. We've seen quite a few where if a teacher resigns prior to their contract being up, you can have a complaint filed against you with our office. If you resign before June 30, then it would not be an ethical violation. But anytime after June 30th, then your administrators, they can file a complaint with our office, and you could be looking at a reprimand, a suspension. It just kind of depends on what your district asks for. They're responsible for prosecuting those contract violations. So they're going to be the ones that kind of determine how much of a sanction you get. So just something to be aware of. I know at the end of the year, we always get antsy and we want to make sure we have another job in place, but just understand that if you have that contract, you're going to be held to it. So make sure if you're looking to switch jobs that you kind of do it early and get it done. So that way you're not finding yourself in the middle of 2 contracts. The next standard 6, is failure to protect health and safety. This is kind of a catch-all area. This can include, there was a situation that we had reported to us where a coach had students who were running drills at practice because a student had stolen something. And so as punishment, he had the students running drills until some of the students actually got sick. It was reported to the BOEE. It would be considered corporal punishment. And so instead of conditioning, he was doing it as a form of punishment, which is not something you can do in the state of Iowa. So he did receive a reprimand from our office because of that. And it was failure to protect the health and safety of students. So it's a pretty broad ranging standard. So you need to be thoughtful about, you know, always protecting them. It includes discrimination. It includes embarrassment and how you treat your colleagues or how you treat your students. So always making sure that you kind of keep to that higher standard with your students and staff. Really important because you can fall under this category. And something to be aware of in our office is that these complaints that we receive, it's not just your administration that can file a complaint. It's also a parent or a legal guardian. They can file a complaint with our office. Another teacher can file a complaint, an administrator. We also see boards of education. So there's a variety of folks that can file a complaint in our office. Oftentimes, under this standard 6 is where we kind of see some of the parent complaints that come in. So just be thoughtful of that, because this is an area that parents kind of tend to glom on to if there's an issue or a concern. Now, also be aware, we're keenly aware that sometimes parents are upset because their students don't get enough playing time. Not necessarily an area that our board is going to take up as an ethical issue if you're not playing a student. So also something to be aware of. Our board is, made up of other educators as well as a couple public members. So they do consider those things. Standard 7 is compliance with legal obligations. This is your child support payments and IRS payments. So pretty simple there, as long as you're keeping up. And then standard 8 is incompetence, which is kind of not used very often and really deals with whether or not you are fulfilling your duties as a teacher and meeting those teaching standards. So that is a kind of a nuts and bolts view of our 8 ethical standards. We also come out sometimes and do a more in-depth ethical spiel on all of these standards. Like I said, today we're going to focus a little bit more on boundaries and things of that nature. So as we're moving forward here, I just want to pause for a second and see if anybody has any questions. Sure, it's sort of difficult when I'm on a big screen and you all are watching. So if you have questions at all, send them to me through the chat and I will try to get those answered for you. So we talked about some of the mandatory reporting areas. These are the 4 areas of mandatory reporting, and hopefully you can see them. Sometimes this doesn't show up very well on the screen, but it's inappropriate relationships, falsification of official documents, misuse of public funds and property, and consumption or having consumed alcohol or drugs on school property or at a school-sponsored event. So those are the 4 areas that your administrator has to report you for. Another note, say that you go out and have a drink before the big game. Maybe not advisable if you show up then at the game and you're talking to a parent and you've had a beer and they smell it. We have had instances where something like that does get reported to our office and your administrators have to report that. So just something to think about whenever you're attending a school event or anything of that nature, that you're always keeping that in the back of your mind as being an important thing to think about. So the area that I want to pay attention to today, it's under student abuse. It's soliciting, encouraging, or consummating a romantic or otherwise inappropriate relationship. And I really think it's important for you guys to think about the otherwise inappropriate relationship. Like I said, there's a small percentage of folks that are having a romantic or a sexual relationship with students. But then there's the otherwise inappropriate relationship, and that can be a student and a teacher acting more like friends than like student and teacher. So hanging out outside of school or doing things together, going to basketball games together where it's just the 2 of them and they're just friends. Or it can also include providing alcohol or liquor to a student. There's just a myriad of different things that can occur and fall under that otherwise inappropriate relationship with the student. And we want to really keep you away from that and make sure that you have appropriate boundaries, and always keep that student-teacher boundary so that they understand it's student and teacher, not student and friend or student and parent or student and boyfriend. Just always making sure that we understand that. We do see a lot of cases that fall in the otherwise category. So here are some statistics from our office. You can see over the years that we have a fair amount of inappropriate relationships that get reported to our office. We're averaging about 10 a year, which again is a very small fraction compared to all the teachers and all the staff out there. So, I mean, we have amazing teachers and staff in Iowa. There's just this small percentage that really cross that line. And we're just encouraging you to have appropriate boundaries and to make sure your colleagues are having appropriate boundaries too. Here are some statistics. So 3.5 million students, 7% reported that between 8th and 11th grade that they had some sort of physical sexual contact from an adult. And unwanted touching could include unwanted touching all the way up to sexual intercourse. About 10% of children reported they had been shown pornography or had sexually explicit language. And then oftentimes adults, when they were made aware or knew that it was going on, didn't necessarily report it because they were protecting their colleagues. So a student, for our purposes, for the BOEE and our rules, extends 30 days from the last date of their enrollment. So for students who are in summer sports, it's going to be 30 days after those sports end. And it also then extends 90 days from the last date of enrollment if the licensee ever taught directly or supervised that former student in their class or activity. So in my mind, I'd be thinking that 90-day timeline in terms of who's considered a student for purposes of these ethics rules. One thing I will tell you is if there is a student and teacher relationship that occurs on day 91, somebody's probably going to still investigate you. So just be thoughtful of that because that does occur sometimes. Now, this one might be especially important for coaches because there is no such thing as a pre-existing relationship. So there may be, and we see this a couple of times a year, where there's a student who graduates high school and they have a girlfriend who is still in high school because they're a senior, she's a junior, and they become a coach and want to be able to coach and still date. Unfortunately, our rules don't allow for that. So we generally have to tell that coach that they're going to either have to wait to coach or they're going to have to break off that relationship. And oftentimes what we see is they just relinquish their coaching license until such time that it's going to be more convenient for them. Here is the criminal statute on sexual exploitation. So there's a crime to sexually exploit students with a pattern and practice or a scheme of conduct. That conduct generally for sexual exploitation and for the criminal statute, it's sexual conduct. And you'll see there's that list of sexual conduct, kissing, touching, all the way up to sexual intercourse. But I will tell you, there is a Supreme Court case where the individual was found guilty of sexual exploitation by a school employee for hugging a student. Now, that hugging also encompassed lots of text messages, lots of emails, lots of conversations, lots of hugs. The individual would often call the student down to their room and say, I'm having a really bad day. Can you skip out of class and come and give me a hug? I could really use a hug. And so there was a lot of that going on. And the court really found that all of the circumstances put together with the text messages and the hugging and that physical contact, they found in that case that the physical contact was for sexual gratification. So the hugging that occurred was not innocent. It was not a hug to congratulate. It was not a hug to comfort someone. It was generally hugs for sexual gratification of that teacher with that student. So I just want you to be aware of that case because they have found that if there is enough of that conduct along with everything else and all of the facts and circumstances, you could be found guilty of sexual exploitation, which, again, if you look at the list in the criminal statute, it does not say hugging in the criminal statute, but the court clearly found that that was encompassed in that sexual conduct because of the reason that the teacher was doing it. So something to be aware of. I don't want to scare you. That doesn't mean you can't hug your students. Again, if it's for congratulations or if it's for, maybe somebody passed away or died or something, you can certainly do those things. You can side hug them, you can give them a fist bump. You know, there's all sorts of ways that you can do that without having it meet your needs and not the needs of that student. Real quick, I just wanted to touch upon Chapter 102 investigations. If a student or a parent files a complaint against you alleging either physical abuse or sexual abuse, your district will be the ones to do the initial investigation, and it's called the Chapter 102 investigation. So just be aware of that. It's not an investigation that goes to DHS because you're not considered a caretaker of the student. So it is the responsibility of the school district to do that investigation. So I want to touch upon who is a predator? Who are we looking at? What should we be aware of in our surroundings to make sure that we're not crossing boundaries and that we're not missing something? You can't determine it through a background check because a lot of times they haven't even been caught yet. So even, you know, the best of all background checks aren't going to catch someone who hasn't gotten caught yet. And they really try hard not to get caught if it's something that they're doing with purpose. So there are two types of abusers. There's the fixated abuser and an opportunistic abuser, and they're really a little different in the respects of how they operate. Your fixated abuser is an individual or a person who really works hard to gain the trust of the school, the teachers, the student, and the parents. So over a period of time, that individual is working to gain trust, and then they move, after they've gained that trust, they move forward with more physical behavior once they have that trust. So we'll talk about a couple examples here. So just kind of pulling up some of my notes here so I don't forget anything. Here's an example. So a fixated abuser, they're often found in elementary schools or middle schools. And it's more likely to be a male who is the abuser than a female. And they're oftentimes considered to be a great teacher. That doesn't mean all great teachers are bad. It just means that sometimes the ones that do commit the crimes are have worked really hard to be recognized as a great teacher. And that's kind of part of them, part of their role when they're trying to solicit a student. Many times they have awards, and the accused generally protects them, and so do the people around them, because the person's so nice and so likable and such a great teacher that most people just think there's no way they did this. It's just not possible. They're just a great teacher. So here's an example of a teacher who would have this type of relationship with a male student. Let me back up for a sec. So oftentimes they'll identify a male as a victim, and then the teacher will say, hey, you know, I think you need help with math class. So can you stay after school? That student then will come after school every day. They might start giving the student gifts. And then once they've earned the trust of the student and even the parents, that's when they move to the next level and start to get a little bit more intimate with that student, whether it be more touching or physical contact. They're really working hard, the fixated abuser, they're working hard to gain the trust of everybody around them and that student, that way they can move forward. The same kind of goes for a female student. Might be a student who is a wonderful singer. So the choir teacher asked the student to come in and sing and, you know, do extra activities within the room, really get to know that student and gain that trust. And then once they have that trust and they have the trust of the family and everybody around them, that's when they tend to move forward and with more aggressive behaviors. So that's really a fixated abuser. And again, these folks are few and far between in the education system. I've worked with educators long enough to know this is a small fraction of folks that are actually fixated abusers, where they're purposefully going into schools and looking to hurt students or have these relationships. A lot of times what you actually see is the opportunistic abuser. And this is a little different flavor. So the opportunistic abuser tends to be, I would say, with older students, and it also tends to be an abuser who maybe is going through their own issues. Maybe they're going through a divorce, or maybe they're having some mental health issues, or they're having their own issues with their self-esteem. These folks tend to hang out with students and act as their peers. And when they do that, sometimes they blur and they cross lines with the students because they're putting themselves in that position where they're friends with the students. And then over time, sometimes that's what leads into more inappropriate behavior. So I would say this is probably a little bit more of what we see, where sometimes it just crosses lines. And so I'll give you a couple examples of this. And one thing I would really tell you is, I think, with the pandemic and everything that we've gone through in the last couple of years, you really have to have some self-care. If you are going through something personally at home, or you have a friend who's going through something personally, this is a time where they really need support. And you don't want to get support from your students, because that's where you start to blur lines of boundaries. If a student starts being your support system, then that's how sometimes we blur lines. And so you really need to take care of yourself and just make sure your colleagues are taking care of themselves as well. So here's an example of an opportunistic abuser. This one is a younger girl who actually had reported abuse from one of her teachers, and a middle schooler. She reported it, but none of the other teachers believed her. So they actually, students and staff were not very kind to this girl. And the accused teacher eventually confessed, but by then the student had left the school because nobody believed her. Because really that teacher had gained the trust of the people around him. Here's another example. It's a female teacher, thinks she's in love with a student. She may have her own weak self-image and get excited talking to a 17-year-old boy, and she believes that because he's a teenager, it's okay. It's acceptable to pursue him because he's not a kid, closer to her age. And once he flatters her, then she feels like it's okay. And we have some examples of this that have been reported to our board. So we'll get into some of those examples here. And here's an example of a male teacher who followed a similar pattern, finds himself attracted to a student, starts to flirt with her, kind of treats her as a peer. And then again, because she's a teenager, it seems acceptable to him to date her. And they start dating and flattering each other. And again, it doesn't matter if the student's 16, 17, doesn't matter if they're 18, they still can't consent under the law. Sexual exploitation is going to get the 16-year-old, 17-year-old, and the 18-year-old. You're going to be in trouble even if they are considered the age of consent in Iowa, which is 16, because of that sexual exploitation law. And another thing I want to point out is any of the behavior all the way up to that point of, say there's no sexual contact, say it is just joking or flirting or, hanging out on the weekend or something like that, where there's no actual kissing, hugging, or sexual contact, it could still be in that otherwise inappropriate category. And we've seen that too. We had a teacher who really wanted to connect with his students. So he would get online and on a gaming system, and he'd game with students at night. And so he's just kind of going back and forth, gaming with students, chit-chatting with them about their lives. And, that was found to be an inappropriate relationship. And, in his mind, he's trying to get on their level and get to know students. But gaming with students outside of school at night on the weekends, not going to be okay when we start looking at those cases. We really want you to maintain the teacher-student relationship and the coach-student relationship, because that's what you're there for. Okay. That's kind of a mouthful right now. Before I move on to the phases of sexual exploitation, any questions? I'm not sure if I can see if I have any in the chat here. No questions. I just wanted to pause for a second. So let's see here. All right. So we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to be mindful of your time. So I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. There are 3 phases of sexual exploitation. The first phase is trolling and testing, and this is the phase where the offender is looking for a school that has loose policies. And maybe individuals aren't paying as much attention. It's also looking for a student who is vulnerable, and parents who are maybe not there for the student, or are just not as involved with the student. So that's, they're looking for that victim in terms of who would be an easy target. Phase 2 is the grooming stage that we talked about. And in the grooming stage, the offender is someone who kind of sets up that public persona of, I'm a really nice guy, I'm a great teacher. So everybody likes him and trusts him. And once they gain that likability and that trust, then they move on to the next phase. And the next phase is that exploiting and lulling phase. And the exploiting and lulling phase is when they become more aggressive with their behavior. They start to care more about the student. They oftentimes, they isolate the student and tell the student, hey, if you tell anybody about our relationship, I'm going to get fired. So, don't tell anybody. And oftentimes students won't tell. We have several cases that it's an adult coming back to the school and reporting that they had been exploited by a teacher. And we've seen that fairly often, surprisingly. So I'm going to go over a couple cases in Iowa. Some of you may or may not be familiar with them. I don't think I have any from your area exactly. Christopher Lee, he was a East Mills district. He was a art teacher and a track coach, and he was accused of groping and having other sexual contact with a female student. He was charged with 2 counts of sexual exploitation and convicted, and he lost his license. He had to surrender it as well. Frederick Mendel, he was a Council Bluffs High School band teacher, charged with 2 counts of sexual exploitation, had messages between him and the student professing their love. This was a longtime teacher. He was there 30 years, and he was convicted and had to surrender his license. Now, I will tell you, you're going to see a trend here, because this is an art teacher here in Des Moines East, charged with sexual exploitation of a 16-year-old. The trend here is you oftentimes see in like specials, art teachers, band teachers, music teachers, coaches, anybody who has one-on-one time with students, they tend to get themselves in the situation. They're a little bit more likely to be in that situation where they might start to have feelings with students because of that one-on-one time they have. So especially important in those areas, just to make sure you have appropriate boundaries with your students. So this teacher convicted and had to surrender his license as well. Here's one, Sioux Center Christian School. This one was younger kiddos. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison for sexually abusing 15 students over a 4-year period. He's in prison and he doesn't have a license anymore. Here's a gal who decided it would be a good idea to send a nude photo of herself to her student. Highly frowned upon. I wouldn't do that. Got her in trouble. She lost her license as well. And then the next gal, she's kind of interesting. If you ever get a free moment, go on to Dr. Phil and look this gal up. She's kind of a hoot. She's kind of off her rocker. She got convicted of exploitation for having a sexual relationship with a 17-year-old student. And after she got fired by the district for having this relationship, she decided to become a stripper at a local strip club. And while she was while she was out awaiting trial, she got in trouble on pretrial release because the student came and met her in the parking lot of the strip club. So she wasn't supposed to have contact with the student, and yet she's still having contact. She's not very bright. She was convicted. She did lose her license. And again, like I said, she is like the exact example of who not to be. Okay, so if you ever want to look up somebody, look her up because she's really interesting, and it's probably worth checking out. Okay, so we got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to just breeze through these school district responsibilities. One of their number one responsibilities is just to maintain that safe and healthy and secure environment for all students. That's why I'm training you on this today, to just make you aware of your boundaries. And also I want you to be aware of what your colleagues are doing and making sure that they're aware of their boundaries. You know, school districts have to work on background checks, policies, training, all of those things to make sure that students and teachers are safe for both of you. It's good for you to set those boundaries for yourself and for the students. It can go both ways. You can have a student that thinks they're attracted to a teacher, and really setting those boundaries is super important. We're going to skip through this. Got hiring handbook policies. Really pay attention to social media. Highly recommend you do not give your students your cell phones or your social media accounts. Most school districts have mechanisms to communicate with students, the Remind app, Google Classroom, things like that. Try to use school equipment and school programming to contact your students, so you're not giving them your personal cell phone. That's a really important boundary, because once they have it, it gets really loose in terms of your use. So recommend that you kind of stay away from social media with your students, and you stay away from cell phone use with your students if you can help it, and use some of those school apps. And then also be mindful of the time frame in which you're talking to your students. You know, if it's after school because you're at practice, great. Probably wouldn't send them a message at 9-10 o'clock at night unless you're sending it on the school app and it's a reminder about practice the next morning. Get your staff trained. Like I said, try maintaining those appropriate boundaries. And then one of the big things that the legislature is worried about is they feel like some of these teachers, once they resign, they move on to the next school district and nobody says anything. 99% of the time, that is not the case. Districts are reporting these individuals. We call it passing the trash. They are reporting individuals and not just passing them on to another district for more victims. So something to be aware of. So I'm going to leave you guys with this last tidbit of information. It's sample school district behavior guidelines. And I sent this out to your administrator. There is a bookmark that kind of shows you these behavior guidelines. These are just reminders. It's a reminder of what is a good behavior, what's a not so good behavior, and what's a red light behavior. And these are the things that I want you to think about. So when you have relationships with your students, these are the good green light behaviors we want you to have. Humor, friendly comments, complimenting your student. Hey, that's a great job. You did awesome. But not saying, oh, I love your hair, or you look awesome in that skirt. You know, trying not to keep it overly personal is really important. Make sure that you talk and treat all students the same and in a similar manner. Don't single out a student. Try to have an open door policy when you're with students. Make sure the doors are open, other people are around if you cannot all help it. It just protects you and it protects the student. And again, try and spend your time with all students, not just one. And I know when you're working one-on-one with students, that's not as easy, but just be mindful of all these things so that you put yourself in a good situation. So here's some yellow light behaviors. And these again are kind of those grooming behaviors, starting to single out one student for favors, giving them overly personal notes or cards or compliments that are a little bit, that are about how they look, or how you feel, teasing, you know, sexual innuendos, anything like that, trying to stay away from those kind of things and trying to maintain that boundary of teacher student. So these are kind of those yellow light behaviors where if you start to see them, sometimes you're going to recognize them. And when you do recognize it, that's when you should say something to your administrators or even to your colleague about how it's inappropriate. We've had lots of cases where other colleagues said, yeah, I knew what was going on and I didn't say anything and I told him he should stop, but you know, but he didn't. You could be on the hook for that too. So if you know what's going on and you don't report it, perfect example, Mary Beth Hagelin, I think there was some of that going on, and some other folks in the school district got in trouble because they knew what was going on and didn't report it. So just make sure that, you know, you're letting people know, hey, that's not a good idea, and make sure you report it. And then finally, those red light behaviors. Any of these behaviors, it should definitely be reported to the district so they can handle it and deal with it. And remember, if you report it to your administrator, then they're the ones who can file the complaint with us. So, I mean, it takes a lot off your back when you're not the one to do that. Again, I apologize. I feel like I've kind of spoon fed all this information to you in a very short amount of time to kind of fit into your day. I don't know if anybody has any questions, but I'm just going to pause now and see if anybody does. It's about 5 minutes till. And again, I want to respect your time.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.